In the small town of Tacoma Park, Maryland, in 2015, life flowed at a steady, unhurried pace. The streets lined with modest homes and shaded by old trees carried an air of quiet predictability. Jared Wilson, a 25-year-old man brimming with energy and determination, had recently married his longtime friend, 23-year-old Camilla Thomas. The couple had settled into a simple house on the outskirts of town, a place with peeling paint and a small front yard that hinted at their humble beginnings. Jared spent his days working as an auto mechanic at a local garage, his hands often stained with grease as he tinkered with engines. He harbored a dream of one day opening his own repair shop, a vision that fueled his long hours and tireless effort. Camilla, meanwhile, was nearing the end of her nursing courses, her evenings filled with textbooks and study notes as she prepared for a career in healthcare. Together, they mapped out a future that felt within reach, their shared optimism a thread that bound them tightly. Camilla's family lived just a few blocks away, their presence a steady anchor for the young couple. Her mother, Loretta Thomas, a 47-year-old woman with a composed demeanor, held a respected position as an administrator at the town's public library. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her days spent organizing shelves, assisting patrons, and managing the library's modest budget. Loretta had been married for over 2 decades to Raymond, a reserve truck driver whose job kept him on the road for days at a time. His absences were a familiar rhythm in their household, leaving Loretta to manage the home alone more often than not. To outsiders, the Thomas family appeared as a pillar of stability, a reliable fixture in the community where neighbors waved and doors remained unlocked. Jared often stopped by the Thomas residence, his visits a natural extension of his new role as Camilla's husband. Sometimes he came to fix a leaky faucet or carry heavy bags of groceries from the car, other times he lingered after dinner, sipping coffee at the kitchen table while the family swapped stories about their day. Loretta greeted him warmly each time, her smile bright and welcoming as she set an extra plate or poured him a glass of iced tea. She appreciated his willingness to lend a hand, his easy laugh filling the room in a way that felt comforting. But as the weeks passed, something shifted in her gaze. What began as simple gratitude for his presence grew into a flicker of something deeper, a quiet stirring she couldn't quite name. She noticed the way his shoulders flexed when he lifted a toolbox, the spark in his eyes when he talked about his plans. It was a subtle change, one she buried beneath her routine, but it lingered in the corners of her mind. Loretta's marriage to Raymond had long since settled into a muted existence. The passion that once defined their early years had faded, replaced by a pattern of polite exchanges and practical concerns. When Raymond was home, their conversations revolved around bills, grocery lists, or the weather, the silences between them stretching longer with each passing year. His time on the road left Loretta with ample space to reflect, and in that stillness, a restlessness took root. She moved through her days with efficiency, checking in library books, watering the plants on the porch, cooking meals for one, but a quiet ache gnawed at her. Jared's frequent visits became a break in the monotony, a fleeting glimpse of vitality that her life with Raymond no longer offered. She told herself it was nothing, a harmless appreciation for the young man her daughter had chosen, yet the warmth in her chest when he walked through the door hinted at something she wasn't ready to face. For now, the rhythm of Tacoma Park rolled on, its surface calm masking the currents beginning to swirl beneath. Loretta found her thoughts drifting to Jared more often as the days went by. His youth, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, and the small, thoughtful gestures he made, like holding the door open or offering to carry something heavy, stirred feelings she hadn't acknowledged in years. At first, she dismissed them as fleeting, a harmless flicker of admiration for the man who had become part of her family. But the flicker grew, warming her in a way that made her restless. She began to orchestrate moments to see him, her actions subtle but deliberate. One afternoon, she asked him to fix an old lamp in the garage, claiming the wiring had gone bad, though she could have easily called an electrician. Another evening, she lingered at the table after dinner, pouring him an extra cup of coffee and steering the conversation toward trivial things, the weather, a book she'd read, anything to keep him there a little longer. Jared, accustomed to her maternal warmth, didn't pick up on the shift right away. He saw her attention as an extension of the care she'd always shown, a natural part of being welcomed into the Thomas household. The change crept in slowly, unnoticed by anyone but Loretta herself. She caught herself watching him when he wasn't looking, her eyes tracing the lines of his jaw or the way his hands moved as he worked. She scolded herself silently, pushing the thoughts down, but they resurfaced each time he stepped through the door. Then came the moment that altered everything. One quiet evening, with Camilla out running errands and Raymond away on a haul, Jared stayed behind to help Loretta move a heavy box of books to the attic. They ended up alone in the living room, the air thick with the scent of dust and old paper. As he handed her a book, their fingers brushed, and Loretta let her touch linger just a fraction too long. The contact sent a jolt through her, a rush of heat she hadn't felt in decades. She pulled her hand back quickly, her eyes darting to the floor, but the tension hung between them, palpable and unspoken. Jared shifted his weight, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing, and the moment passed as if it hadn't happened. Yet for Loretta, it was a spark that refused to fade. From that day, her actions grew bolder. She invented excuses to step out of the house, an extra shift at the library, a trip to the store, knowing she'd cross paths with Jared somewhere along the way. She'd catch him after work, suggesting they grab a soda at the diner down the road, framing it as a casual thank you for his help around the house. Jared hesitated at first, his instincts nudging him that something felt off, but Loretta's persistence wore him down. She had a way of making it seem normal, her tone light and her invitations innocent enough to brush aside any doubts. Before long, their encounters moved beyond the edges of Takoma Park. They found a motel just off the highway, a nondescript place with faded curtains and a flickering neon sign, far enough from town to avoid prying eyes. The first time they met there, Loretta's heart pounded with a mix of guilt and exhilaration, her hands trembling as she locked the door behind them. For her, it was an escape, a chance to break free from the gray monotony that had swallowed her life. For Jared, it was something else, a reckless pull he couldn't fully grasp, a thrill that tugged at him even as he questioned why he kept coming back. Their meetings settled into a clandestine rhythm. Loretta would slip away in the late afternoons, her purse slung over her shoulder as she told Raymond or Camilla she had paperwork to finish at the library. Jared would arrive separately, his truck parked at the far end of the lot, his cap pulled low as he walked to the room they'd claimed as their own. Inside those walls, time seemed to bend, the outside world falling away as they lost themselves in each other. Loretta felt alive again, her senses sharpened by the secrecy and the rush of something forbidden. Jared, though drawn in by her intensity, carried a flicker of unease he couldn't shake. He told himself it was nothing serious, just a detour from the life he'd built with Camilla, but the weight of it grew heavier with each visit. Back at home, Camilla began to notice subtle changes. Jared's hours stretched longer, his excuses about late nights at the garage piling up. She brushed it off as stress or extra work, her trust in him holding firm, but a quiet doubt started to take root, whispering that something wasn't quite right. For now, the town slept on, its stillness masking the fragile threads beginning to unravel. The affair between Loretta and Jared intensified as the weeks slipped by, their stolen moments in the motel growing more frequent and charged with urgency. The secrecy that once thrilled them now wove a tighter web around their lives, pulling them deeper into a connection neither had fully anticipated. Loretta felt the pull strongest, her days at the library passing in a blur as her thoughts circled back to Jared, to the way his presence erased the emptiness she'd carried for years. Jared, too, found himself caught up in the momentum, his initial hesitation giving way to a reckless abandon that surprised even him. They moved through their separate routines, her at the library desk, him under the hood of a car, but the pull between them grew undeniable, a current that swept them along with little regard for the consequences. Then came the moment that shattered the fragile balance. Loretta noticed the signs first, a faint queasiness in the mornings, a tiredness that clung to her despite ample sleep. She dismissed it as stress, a byproduct of her double life, until the realization hit her with cold clarity. A trip to the drugstore confirmed it, she was pregnant. The test sat heavy in her hand, its two pink lines staring back at her like an accusation. Panic surged through her breath catching as the implications sank in. At 47, she hadn't imagined herself facing this again, not now, not like this. The thought of carrying Jared's child threatened everything: her marriage to Raymond, her bond with Camilla, the carefully constructed life she'd maintained in Takoma Park. Shame mingled with fear, her mind racing with images of whispered gossip, pointed fingers, and a family torn apart. She decided then that it couldn't go on. She would end the pregnancy, sever the tie with Jared, and bury the whole affair in the past, locking it away like a book shelved and forgotten. When she told Jared, she chose a quiet moment after one of their motel meetings, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she forced the words out. His reaction caught her off guard. Where she saw a crisis, he saw possibility. His eyes lit up with a strange mix of surprise and determination, his posture straightening as he processed the news. He admitted he'd grown weary of the pretense in his marriage to Camilla, the constant effort to play the devoted husband while his heart pulled him elsewhere. The pregnancy, to him, was a turning point, a chance to leave behind the life he'd outgrown and build something new with Loretta. He suggested they make it real, that she leave Raymond and he leave Camilla, so they could raise the child together. His voice carried a quiet conviction, as if he'd already envisioned them as a family, free from the shadows they'd been hiding in. For a fleeting moment, Loretta glimpsed the life he described, but the vision dissolved under the weight of her dread. She recoiled at the idea, her mind spinning with the chaos it would unleash. The scandal would ripple through Takoma Park, staining her reputation and shattering the fragile peace she'd clung to with Raymond. She pictured Camilla's face, the betrayal that would carve itself into her daughter's eyes, and the thought made her stomach churn. Stability, however dull, had been her anchor. To abandon it for something so uncertain felt like stepping off a cliff. She shook her head, her resolve hardening as she rejected his proposal. Jared pressed harder, his frustration bubbling up as he argued that they couldn't just erase what had happened, that the child deserved more than a secret ending. Loretta dug in, her fear sharpening into defiance as she insisted on the abortion, on cutting him out of her life entirely. Each refusal fueled his persistence, and each plea from him stoked her desperation, until the air between them crackled with unresolved tension. The rift widened, their once shared escape now a battleground of clashing desires. They couldn't leave it unresolved, not with so much hanging in the balance. After days of strained silences and avoided glances, they agreed to meet one last time to settle things. Jared suggested a spot he'd found weeks earlier, a dilapidated cabin tucked along the banks of the Potomac River, its weathered boards sagging under years of neglect. It sat far enough from town to keep their discussion private, its isolation a mirror to the corner they'd backed themselves into. Loretta agreed, her heart heavy with the certainty that this would be the end. She drove there under a gray sky, the river's slow churn a distant hum as she steeled herself for what lay ahead. Jared arrived shortly after, his truck kicking up dust on the overgrown path, his face set with a determination she hadn't seen before. The cabin loomed ahead, its shadowed interior waiting to hold the weight of their unraveling. The meeting at the cabin began with a stillness that belied the storm brewing beneath. Jared stepped inside first, his boots scuffing against the warped wooden floor as he turned to face Loretta, who followed with hesitant steps. The air inside smelled of damp earth and mildew, the faint light filtering through cracked windows casting long shadows across the room. They stood a few feet apart, the rickety table between them a silent witness to the tension that had brought them there. Jared's shoulders were squared, his jaw tight with resolve as he laid out his case, his hands gesturing with quiet intensity. He painted a picture of a life they could share, one where the child growing inside her became the cornerstone of something new, something real. His eyes searched hers, seeking a crack in the wall she'd built, a sign that she might bend to his vision. Loretta stood rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as his words washed over her. Fear coiled in her gut, a cold weight that drowned out his pleas. She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line as she countered his every point with trembling determination. The pregnancy, to her, was a mistake to be erased, a threat to the fragile order she clung to. She pushed back against his optimism, her voice quivering as she accused him of being blind to the wreckage their choices would leave behind. Her mind flashed with images of Camilla's heartbreak, Raymond's quiet judgment, the whispers that would follow her through Tacoma Park. Jared's patience frayed as she dug in, his tone sharpening with each refusal. He stepped closer, his hands dropping to his sides as he urged her to stop hiding, to see the child as more than a burden she could cast aside. The space between them shrank as the argument escalated, their voices clashing in the cramped cabin. Loretta's fear twisted into anger, her body trembling as she flung back his accusations, her words laced with bitterness. Jared matched her intensity, his frustration spilling over as he demanded she look beyond herself, beyond the fears that held her captive. The air grew thick, the weight of their clashing wills pressing against the walls. Loretta backed toward the table, her hands brushing its edge as she sought something solid to anchor her spiraling emotions. Her fingers grazed the cold surface of a heavy glass sugar bowl, its chipped rim the only remnant of the cabin's forgotten past. She barely registered it at first, her focus locked on Jared's relentless push, until a surge of rage broke through her restraint. In a single, fluid motion, she seized the sugar bowl and hurled it at him, her arm swinging with a force born of desperation. The glass arced through the air, catching the dim light before it struck Jared square in the temple. The impact sounded with a dull thud, followed by a sickening crack as he staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching for his head. He crumpled to the floor, his body hitting the boards with a heavy thump, blood pooling beneath him in a dark, spreading stain. Loretta froze, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. The cabin fell silent, save for the faint drip of blood on wood, the sugar bowl rolling to a stop near the wall. She stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. No pulse met her touch, Jared was gone. Panic seized her, her mind racing as she stared at his lifeless form. The blood matted his hair, his eyes half open in a vacant stare that bore into her. She lurched to her feet, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she backed away, her hands clutching at her coat. She couldn't stay, couldn't face what she'd done. With a final glance at the scene, Jared sprawled on the floor, the overturned sugar bowl glinting faintly, she turned and fled. The river murmured outside as she stumbled to her car, her shoes sinking into the muddy path. She drove back to Tacoma Park, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her face a mask of forced calm by the time she stepped into her house. She moved through the evening as if nothing had changed, washing dishes and folding laundry, her mind numbly repeating that no one would know. The next morning, Camilla's confusion broke the silence. Jared hadn't come home. By midday, she called the police, her voice tight with worry, while Loretta sat in the kitchen, her hands folded, her secret burning beneath her skin. The Tacoma Park Police launched their investigation into Jared's disappearance with a methodical sweep of the town's edges, their patrol cars weaving through quiet streets as the afternoon sun dipped low. They discovered his truck first, parked haphazardly on a dirt pull-off near the Potomac River, its keys still dangling in the ignition. The vehicle sat undisturbed, its tires caked with dried mud, but no signs of a struggle marred the scene, no broken glass, no scuff marks, just an eerie stillness that raised more questions than answers. Officers combed the surrounding brush, their boots crunching through fallen leaves, but the trail went cold at the water's edge. Back at home, Camilla unraveled under the weight of her husband's absence. Her hands trembled as she dialed her parents, her voice breaking as she pleaded for their help. Raymond arrived that evening, his truck rumbling into the driveway after a long haul, his face etched with exhaustion as he tried to steady his daughter's fraying nerves. Loretta hovered at the edges of their grief, her presence a shadow that flickered between rooms. She avoided Camilla's searching gaze, her eyes darting to the floor whenever her daughter spoke Jared's name. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, her usual composure cracking under an unseen strain. She slipped out of the house more often, claiming late hours at the library or errands that stretched into the night, her excuses delivered with a clipped edge that hadn't been there before. Raymond, preoccupied with consoling Camilla, chalked it up to stress, his own weariness blinding him to the shift. But Camilla felt it, a gnawing unease that settled in her chest, sharpened by the days Jared had spent drifting away before he vanished. She replayed their last weeks together, her mind snagging on fragments, the times he'd mentioned helping her mother with some task, the evenings he'd come home late with grease-streaked clothes and vague explanations. Her suspicion deepened one gray afternoon when she rummaged through Loretta's purse, searching for a spare set of keys to the shed. Her fingers brushed against a crumpled receipt, its edges worn as if it had been handled too often. She pulled it out, her breath catching as she read the details, a charge from a motel off Route 410, dated just a week earlier. The name meant nothing to her at first, a cheap roadside stop miles from town, but its presence in her mother's bag struck a dissonant chord. She sat back on her heels, the paper trembling in her hand as pieces began to align, Jared's absences, Loretta's evasiveness, the way they'd both brushed off her questions with practiced ease. The realization clawed at her, a betrayal she couldn't yet name. She confided in a friend later that night, her voice low as she spread the receipt on the table between them. Her friend's eyes narrowed, her advice cutting through Camilla's haze, take it to the police, let them figure out what it meant. Meanwhile, the investigation gained momentum. An anonymous call crackled through the station's line late that evening, the voice hushed and hurried as it pointed detectives to a derelict cabin nestled along the riverbank. The police arrived at dawn, their flashlights slicing through the morning mist as they pushed open the sagging door. Inside, they found Jared sprawled across the floor, his body stiff and cold, a dark gash splitting his temple. Blood had dried in a jagged pool beneath him, the air thick with the coppery tang of it. The glass sugar bowl lay tipped on its side, its weight incongruous in the barren space, its surface smeared with faint prints. The scene told a story of sudden violence, a single, fatal blow that had ended in silence. Detectives crouched over the evidence, their gloved hands cataloging every detail as they pieced together the timeline. Tire tracks scored the muddy path outside, their tread matching the worn grooves of Loretta's sedan, a detail that snapped into focus when they ran the plates. The prints on the sugar bowl sealed it, Loretta's fingerprints, lifted clear and unmistakable from the glass. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions hardening as the implications settled in. They photographed the scene, bagged the bowl, and traced the tracks back to the road, their radios buzzing with updates as the case shifted from a missing person to a homicide. Camilla remained unaware, her mind still tangled in the motel receipt and the questions it raised, while Loretta sat at home, her hands folded in her lap, her face a blank slate hiding the chaos within. The police moved quietly, their net tightening around the woman who'd left her mark on the cabin's grim tableau, the weight of their findings pulling the truth closer to the surface. The police summoned Loretta to the station the morning after they processed the cabin's evidence, their call cutting through the stillness of her kitchen like a blade. She arrived with her coat pulled tight around her, her face a mask of calm that betrayed none of the turmoil churning inside. The interrogation room was stark, its gray walls and fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows as she sat across from two detectives. They began with simple questions, where she'd been the day Jared vanished, what she knew of his habits, but her answers came steady and firm. She claimed she hadn't seen him, hadn't spoken to him, her voice unwavering as she wove a story of routine normalcy. The detectives listened, their expressions neutral, until they slid the first piece of evidence across the table, the motel receipt, its creased edges smoothed flat under their fingers. Loretta's gaze flickered, a crack forming in her facade, but she held her ground, insisting it meant nothing, a forgotten errand from weeks past. The pressure mounted as they laid out more. They presented the fingerprints lifted from the sugar bowl, each ridge a silent accusation tying her to the weapon that had ended Jared's life. They cited the tire tracks, matched her car with precision, and recounted a neighbor's account, how she'd been seen scrubbing her sedan's interior late one night, her movements frantic under the glow of a street lamp. Loretta's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles whitening as the weight of their findings pressed down. Her denials faltered, her voice thinning as she stumbled over explanations that no longer held. The detectives leaned in, their questions sharpening, until the dam broke. She crumpled forward, her shoulders shaking as she admitted the truth. Pregnancy had sparked it, a fight had followed, and the sugar bowl had flown from her hand in a moment of blind fury. She swore it wasn't intentional, her words tumbling out in a rush as she painted it as a tragic mistake, a split-second lapse she couldn't undo. The police classified it as manslaughter, their report detailing a crime of passion rather than premeditation, but the label offered little solace. Word reached Camilla that afternoon, delivered by a detective who stood in her doorway, his hat in hand as he recounted the affair and the killing. She sank to the floor, her world splintering as the pieces fell into place, her husband's distance, her mother's evasiveness, the receipt she'd clutched like a lifeline. Grief and betrayal tangled inside her, a raw ache that left her hollow. Raymond learned soon after, his return from a hall cut short by the news. He stood in the living room, his eyes fixed on Loretta's empty chair, his silence heavier than any words. He packed a bag that night and left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the house, his inability to face her a wound too deep to mend. The trial came swiftly, a quiet affair in the county courthouse where the evidence spoke louder than Loretta's pleas. The prosecution outlined her desperation, the defense argued her lack of intent, but the jury deliberated only a day before returning their verdict. They found her guilty, sentencing her to 20 years in prison, with parole possible after 15. She sat motionless as the gavel fell, her face drained of color, her future narrowing to the confines of a cell. Camilla watched from the gallery, her hands clasped tight, her heart a battlefield of loss and rage. The house grew silent in the weeks that followed, its rooms emptied of the life she'd known. Raymond stayed gone, his absence a ghost that lingered in the corners. Camilla packed her own belongings, her nursing books and clothes stuffed into boxes as she resolved to leave Takoma Park behind, to chase a fresh start far from the ruins of her family. She stood alone by the Potomac one final time, the river's current steady and indifferent as it carved its path through the earth. Her footsteps pressed into the soft bank, her eyes tracing the water's flow as she wrestled with the wreckage left in her wake. Jared's death haunted her, a love stolen by the one person she trusted most. Loretta's betrayal cut deeper still, a scar that time might dull but never erase. She turned away, her breath misting in the cool air, her mind heavy with the truth that love could ignite fury, and fury could shatter everything she'd held dear. The town faded into the distance as she walked, its quiet streets a memory she'd carry, a shadow she'd spend years learning to outrun.